Welcome to our second lecture covering Chapter 13. This chapter is the chapter covering performance under Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, specifically talking about seller and buyer duties. Hopefully you've already seen Lecture 1, and I would suggest that if you have just completed Lecture 1, that you wait and watch this video the next day. And the reason I'm going to make that recommendation is I'm going to cover some material that I've already covered in the first lecture again, because at least if you're like me, you may find that hearing something the second time, especially if there's been a day or two gap, can help it make more sense to you. Listening to it 2 times in a row back to back is probably going to be a little bit boring, repetitive, not so useful. So I'm going to suggest you turn me off and come back and listen to me in a day or two so that you'll be able to make the most use of your time. Okay, so I'm going to proceed and I'm going to go forward to slide 10. This is the one where we start having some of that funky vocabulary that we were talking about before. And really all the vocabulary that I'm going to be speaking about probably for the next 10 or so minutes are going to have to do with answering this question: who bears the risk? I am the seller. I am sending the stuff that Bob has decided to buy to Bob. But there's a period of time where it's out of my control and it's not yet in Bob's control. It's maybe with a common carrier. And so as it makes that trip, bad things can happen to it. Storms can come. There can be fires. There can be wrecks of vehicles or boats or planes or all kinds of stuff that could destroy or damage whatever it is that Bob is buying. And so who bears that risk? Who is responsible for managing that risk when neither I, the buyer, nor I, the seller, nor the buyer has any literal control over it? And so I guess there's kind of 2 obvious choices. One is that the buyer is responsible for the risk, that the buyer continues to be responsible until the items are given over to that the seller continues to be responsible until the items are given over to the buyer. Another possibility is that the buyer could get control or bear the risk from the time that it leaves the seller's warehouse until it arrives at the buyer's place of business. Either answer is perfectly valid and there's nothing wrong with either choice, but we need to have a vocabulary so that if I'm entering into a contract with somebody, we have an easy shorthand way of saying, oh, okay, you're bearing the risk, or oh, okay, I'm bearing the risk. In a way, it doesn't really matter which one of us is bearing the risk, be it the seller or the buyer, but we need to know because that's going to cause us to make some adjustments. If the buyer is the one bearing the risk, he's going to want a little bit lower price because he's going to, let's say it would have been $100 to buy whatever this item is. He says to himself, well, I'm going to have to go out and buy insurance, and that insurance will be, say, $4. So I only want to spend $96 on this item if I need to buy the insurance. So the buyer needs to know that he's on the hook for it, so he knows to buy the insurance, and he also knows to negotiate a slightly lower price. If the seller is going to bear the cost, he's not going to be willing to sell it for $96. He's going to want to sell it for the $100. And then he'll go out and buy the insurance for $4. And so his end of the day, what's in his pocket is going to be $96. So it could be either way, the buyer or the seller. It's just we need to have a plan. We need to have a way of talking about this that's really obvious to the parties. And so we're going to talk about a few different terms that are used in this industry to talk about this. Okay, one is going to be the shipment contract. And this is a definition. The shipment and destination contract terms are not actually in your textbook, so you are responsible for them. Be sure to note these definitions. A shipment contract is a contract of sale in which the seller bears the risk only until the shipment of goods arrives at its named place of business. So the buyer bears the risk. The answer to this one is buyer bears the risk. Who bears the risk? In the shipment contract, it's the buyer. The buyer is responsible. In a destination contract, again, here's our definition, which you won't find in the textbook. A contract of sale in which the seller bears the risk of loss all the way until the shipment of goods reaches its named place of arrival. So who bears the risk? It's the seller. All this area where it's neither in the seller's possession or the buyer's possession. Okay, but you know what? Unfortunately, the term shipment and destination contract don't really strongly suggest the answers. Shipment contract doesn't really suggest that the buyer is bearing the risk. Destination contract, at least to me, these terms don't suggest the seller's bearing the risk. So you kind of just have to, double down and just spend some time reviewing these terms. This is my little mnemonic for what it's worth, and I'm not saying it's going to be tremendously helpful, but is I always look at these transactions from the perspective of the seller, from this guy's perspective. And you know what, that makes sense that we look at it from his perspective because the seller is clearly a merchant in whatever this is. The buyer might be a merchant. Obviously, if Toro Lawnmowers is selling to Walmart, then the seller is Toro, buyer is Walmart. They're both merchants. But it could also be that Toro is selling its lawnmowers directly to end-use consumers. Bob Smith, who is buying a Toro lawnmower to mow his own grass. And so in that situation, the buyer is just a consumer, isn't a merchant at all. And so in those situations, the seller is the one that's kind of sophisticated. The seller's the one who's thinking through and defining these terms. So the seller's almost always going to be sophisticated. The buyer can be or might not be. So as we're looking at the terms, it makes sense that we focus upon the seller because the seller is the one that we're probably going to be using the forms of. So as we look at it from the seller's perspective, we consider, well, how long is the seller responsible? Well, until the items ship. So we have the word ship here. So he is going to be on the hook until it gets on board the barge right here. Once the seller turns over the items to the boat, he can wash his hands of it. Hey, I'm not responsible anymore. I am passing the torch to the buyer. Now, of course, the barge company is going to be responsible for it too, but let's assume the barge company goes bankrupt when its barge sinks to the bottom of the Gulf, and so therefore the buyer's only recourse is going to be either the seller, but he doesn't have a recourse to the seller because it's a shipment contract. Let's consider the destination contract. Again, we're going to look at it from the perspective of the seller. So with this term, you can see, well, the seller's saying, well, gosh, I'm going to be on the hook. I'm going to be bearing the risk until it gets to the destination. Where's the destination? The destination is the buyer. So I'm on the hook the whole time. So we're going to view the transaction from the perspective of the seller. Hopefully that will help you make sense of these two terms. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Okay, now we're going to add one more wrinkle to this vocabulary, and that is FOB and FAS. The same rules apply to either one of these, so you can use FOB, whatever the city is, or FAS, whatever the city is, and the answer is going to be the same. FOB stands for free on board, and FAS stands for free alongside. So in order to see how this works, we're going to consider a scenario where the seller is in Houston and the buyer is in Dallas. Now this is not probably the best example, I apologize for it, because we're really talking about shipping contracts. We're talking about things going on water. Well, guess what? There is no body of water between Houston and Dallas. But if we replace I-45, say, with the Mississippi River, and it's between, say, Houston and Dallas, then we might have a situation where these terms make sense. So the seller is down in Houston, the buyer is in Dallas. If we say FOB Houston, again, FOB standing for free on board, or we could say FAS Houston, equal definition, this means that the buyer assumes the risk of something bad happening between Houston and Dallas because the seller is off the hook once it gets to the port of Houston. But if it says FOB Dallas, this means that the seller assumes the risk of something bad happening between Houston and Dallas. As you can see, this is a destination contract because, again, we're looking at it from the perspective of the seller. The seller is thinking to himself, well, when am I off the hook? FOB Houston, I'm off the hook as soon as it gets to the Houston port. FOB Dallas, oh no, I'm not off the hook until it gets to Dallas, to the buyer city. And so again, if we look at this from the perspective of the seller, and he's asking the question of when am I off the hook?
that's what a useful way of considering this. So I'm going to move on. Again, if this is confusing terms, and if it is confusing for you, you are in good company. It confuses me sometimes. You may want to go back and watch the first video again just to refresh it. I spend a little bit more time on those terms. We're going to move on though. We're going to talk about a few other terms. These aren't necessarily the easiest terms, but at least maybe they're not quite as tricky. At least they don't seem as tricky to me. We have the abbreviation CIF, and this is just an abbreviation for cost, insurance, and freight. This means that these three items are included in the price of the goods. So obviously the cost of the item, but we also have insurance and freight. These are the shipping and handling costs. And so if you see on the bill CIF, you know that the buyer doesn't have to go on and buy his own insurance. He doesn't have to pay for the freight. It's including all of those elements. But we can also have C and F, which of course you notice we don't have the I in that, so we just have the cost and the freight. Obviously insurance is not included. Let's consider the X-ship scenario. This works like an FOB destination contract, or we could even say just a destination contract. The seller assumes the risk of something bad happening before the goods reach the buyer. So this is a destination contract. X-ship. This is, I think, our last one of the terms that focus on who bears the risk. So just to summarize our list, we have shipment contracts, we have destination contracts, and then we have the FOB city of origin, FOB destination city, FAS city of origin, FAS destination city, and we also have X-ship. So we have kind of 5 different permutations with this. And be prepared to recognize how each one of those scenarios plays out. Okay, I'm sorry, we have one more. We have the 6th one, which is no arrival, no sale. Now to me, I don't usually consider this one with the other group, because to me this is a lot easier to keep track. The term itself really kind of answers the question. We are looking at this, I guess we can look at it from either the buyer or the seller's perspective. If it doesn't arrive at the buyer's place of business, then there is no sale. And so this is like a destination contract. The buyer only starts being responsible when he or she actually gets the item. The seller remains on the hook until it arrives at the buyer's location. Here's the definition. A contract term that means that if the goods did not arrive at their destination, in other words, the buyer, title does not usually pass to the buyer, and the buyer usually has no liability for the purchase price. Again, I've tweaked this definition a bit. I do put a little caveat here, just kind of FYI, if you decide to go into heavy-duty business where this is a big factor, is I've kind of simplified this. This doesn't capture all of the nitty-gritty details. It's all you need to know for our class, but it's a little bit more complicated than I'm suggesting here. So just kind of a little bit of a caveat as you're thinking about this. So let's play around. Let's just experiment with the FOB situation. Here's our scenario. Your client has sold goods to a buyer using a contract with the terms FOB New Orleans. Your client is the seller, of course. I'll just put seller here. Is in New Orleans. So I'm just going to do one of my super awesome maps. Here we have. So here's Texas. We'll put New Orleans right here and Miami right here. And there's a barge that takes the goods through the Gulf of Mexico. But you know what? There's this catastrophe that happens here. Okay, and now the buyer's saying, you got to pay, seller, and the seller's saying, I don't have to pay. And now we're looking at the terms of the contract to figure out, well, who's right? So FOB New Orleans is, this, again, we're looking at it from the perspective of the seller. So the seller is asking the question of, when am I no longer responsible? Well, FOB New Orleans means the seller stops being responsible once it gets to the port of New Orleans. And of course, that is where the seller, in this case, your client's business is located. So once it got on the barge,
it became the buyer's risk that he was bearing. So let me just show this one more time so you get the flavor of this. Again, instead of having Houston and Dallas, we have New Orleans and Miami, but this would just be putting New Orleans here and Miami here. We'll put it there. So FOB New Orleans means that the buyer assumes the risk of something bad happening between New Orleans and Miami. This is a shipment contract. FOB Miami would have meant, this isn't what we're actually facing in this case, but if it had been written this way, it would mean that the seller, your client, assumes the risk of something bad happening between New Orleans and Miami. And of course, that would be a destination contract. So who bears the risk of the ship sinking in the Gulf? It would be the buyer, the one located in Miami. And is this a shipment contract or a destination contract? It's a shipment contract. Okay. So we have now covered the seller's obligations. Let's just do a refresher though to make sure that we're on board here. The seller has the duty to deliver goods that conform with the contract. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about that from the buyer's perspective in a second, but that is the duty that the seller has. The seller has the duty to deliver those goods in accordance with either the contract if the contract specifies, or if the contract doesn't specify, according to the UCC fill-in-the-blank provisions. And finally, the seller has to deliver the goods at a reasonable hour, not at 3 o'clock in the morning. And now we're going to focus on the buyer's duties, but here's an overview of them. The buyer has to pay for the goods upon delivery. So we're going to talk about how payment might be accomplished. We'll also talk about, well, actually we won't really talk about this one, but it is necessary that the buyer furnish facilities to accept the goods if they're so numerous that you just can't put them into your business right away. And we'll also talk about how the buyer does have the good to accept conforming goods. So let's talk about these in more detail. So the goods have reached the buyer. So we didn't have it go down in the Gulf of Mexico like we talked about. So once the buyer has actually received the goods, the buyer has the opportunity and certainly should take advantage of the opportunity to inspect the goods to make sure that they in fact conform with the terms of the contract. Again, if you order, 3.5-inch widgets with 2 gears made of stainless steel, and you actually get gears that are 3 3/4 inches, or widgets with 3 3/4 inches with 3 gears made up of tin, that's not good. But even if just one of those features didn't match, then that would be a non-conforming good. The buyer needs to pay attention. If the goods are non-conforming, and the buyer could have seen that they were non-conforming but accepted them anyway, it's very likely that the buyer is going to lose his opportunity to object to the non-conformingness. So the buyer can lose that opportunity if the buyer isn't conscientious. But let's assume that the buyer is conscientious in this case, and the buyer does inspect the items carefully, and the buyer, of course, now sees he has non-conforming goods. What does the buyer need to do? Well, usually the buyer has to give the seller an opportunity to cure. Cure in this context has nothing to do with medicine, except although it's an analogous term. So let's look at this definition. This is another term that is not in your textbook, but you are responsible for it. Cure, the right of the seller to correct a delivery of goods that do not conform to the contractual terms made to the buyer within the time specified in the contract. If I have a medication, let's say I have some condition and I need to take a pill, well, that's a cure for my condition. So when the seller replaces the non-conforming goods with the conforming goods, he has cured the problem. He has intervened in a way that has solved the problem. It's not medicine, but it's an analogous idea. Now, you might say, well, why does the buyer have to give the seller an opportunity to cure? Well, it doesn't necessarily follow that he does have to. We have to look to the terms of the contract, but it's a very common provision in contracts that give the seller an opportunity to cure. Part of the reason for that is that, as you can imagine, if I am a seller of lots and lots of things, sometimes the wrong things get mailed. Sometimes it's a trivial problem. Sometimes it's a big deal problem that, for example, let's say that I've decided that I want to buy War and Peace a paperback version of War and Peace from Amazon. And so I go to the Amazon website and I order War and Peace. And when I pull up the book, there's a certain cover on this particular edition of War and Peace, and so I happen to choose that edition. This particular copy of War and Peace, according to the edition, should be on 817 pages, and it was translated by, Bob, we'll say. Okay, so that's the one that I've picked, and I've ordered it, and I've ordered a new copy. A few days pass, or maybe I guess 2 days pass, and I get this in the mail, and I open it up, and it's a new copy, but you know what? It has a different cover picture. It's translated by Bob, and it's, we'll say this one is 820 pages. There's some typesetting differences between the two, but the words themselves are the same. Is that a big deal? I mean, maybe it is, but probably it isn't. Probably I don't care. Now, it might be that it is an issue. For example, the fact that my copy has 6 more pages, and if I'm trying to maybe teach the class or take a class, and every time that the teacher says, well, turn to page 407, line 12, I'm not going to be able to quickly find it. I mean, I won't be super far away. I'll be within a few pages of it, but still, it's going to involve me moving around and trying to find it. And if the teacher were to say things like, write down the 7th word on this particular line, I wouldn't be able to do it because of the different pagination. So it might be huge. Or it could be that I really, really like the cover of that book. That was a really important feature to this book that I valued. Maybe I'm a collector of various copies of War and Peace, and the reason why I wanted this was not so much because I wanted to actually read the book, but because I enjoy having this new cover that I haven't seen before. And so sometimes it's hard to know what the buyer values, whether this is a minor problem. It's really, 99% conforming, and so it's kind of all right that it's not perfect. Or it could be, wow, even though it's mainly conforming, the part that really mattered to the buyer, it's not conforming about. And so you can see that Amazon might have made this mistake of sending me this wrong copy. It might have happened in a couple of different ways. One way it might have happened is Amazon might have realized, gosh, we thought we had this copy that Groover wanted, but actually we don't. We just sold out of it. Somebody was clicking to buy this same edition at the exact same moment Groover was, and that was our last one. And so we could tell Groover, sorry, Groover, we're not going to be able to complete your transaction. But you know what? We're like 95% sure she would be okay with this other edition of War and Peace. It's maybe not her favorite, but really probably what she wants is War and Peace. And it may be really important to her that she get it quickly. Maybe she needs it for a class, and maybe she needs it in 2 days. And so if we were to notify her now, oh, we looked and we couldn't find it, and she thinks she's completed the transaction, so maybe she doesn't check that email every day, it might be a day or two before she notices, oh, we canceled that order. And so now when she goes around, now she's trying to fix it and say, oh, no, I don't care what edition it is. Just send me whatever you got. Now she's going to get it 2 days later, and that's really beyond the time period that she needed it. So quickness was more important than the particular edition. So Amazon might intentionally choose to meet the terms of the contract by sending a non-conforming good. Another possibility, though, is that Amazon might have accidentally sent the non-conforming good. It could be in Amazon's warehouse scenario that an item just found its way to the wrong bucket. Maybe there's a whole bucket of books that are War and Peace, and you know what? Through some human error or robot error or whatever, somehow or another, a copy of, we'll say Gulliver's Travels got into that bin. And so when the order picker picked the items, he didn't know really all he knew was to go to this bin. So he pulled something out, and his job is to move as quickly as possible. And so he reaches in and pulls out Gulliver's Travels. He assumes that's what Groover wants, and so he goes about his business. Now, obviously, in that situation, if I ordered War and Peace and Amazon delivers Gulliver's Travels, that's not a close match. Probably if you want War and Peace, you really don't want Gulliver's Travels. And so that would be an item that isn't a good match. But you can see how in this analysis that it kind of makes sense to give Amazon a do-over, to allow them to fix it. Now, we expect that they are going to have to pay for the return of the book, and we expect that it's going to take a little bit of time for them to send the right one, but usually we want to give them an opportunity to cure because it makes sense. These human accidents happen, and so we want to give the opportunity to fix the problem without resulting in litigation. Anyway, that's the idea behind curing. But of course, if it's really important to the buyer that they really get the right thing from the very beginning, they might want to write contractual language that eliminates the opportunity for the seller to cure. Now let's consider payment. So we've talked about accepting the goods, or at least if they are conforming goods. Now we're going to talk about paying for those goods upon delivery. And here is just some information about how we might go about paying. So after the inspections are complete, and let's assume the items are conforming, of course the buyer has the duty to pay. And of course there's lots of different ways that payment can be accomplished. One is by check, credit card, we could do it by letter of credit, we could do it by a document against a document of title, or by some kind of electronic payment system such as PayPal. We're going to look at a draft though. A draft, this is going to sound like a check, but it's a little bit different than a check. So let's look at the definition, which I have tweaked just a skoonch from the textbook, and consider that in comparison to just a check that you might write from your own checkbook. A draft is an order in writing by one person to another. When we use the word here, person, of course, we're not talking necessarily about human beings, but these could be businesses. So an order in writing by one entity to another, commonly a bank, to pay a specified sum of money to a third person on demand or at a stated future date. This is a special kind of check in which the funds necessary have been confirmed to be available. So this one can't bounce. So it's an unbounceable check. So it's a more a definite and sure payment system than a check, because obviously a check can bounce, right? Let's also consider a letter of credit, which is in some senses similar to a draft. A letter of credit, here's our definition. It's a written promise generally by a bank, so the bank writes the letter of credit, and here I have an example, that it will honor drafts made upon it by a specified customer as long as the conditions described in the letter are met, whatever those conditions are. And it can be irrevocable, meaning it can't be withdrawn. The bank is saying, hey, I'm going to honor this for sure forever. And obviously under these circumstances, both in the draft situation, letter of credit, the bank will have held funds that are supposed to pay for this separate. And so once you have a letter of credit set up, the bank is going to sequester that money until the specified customer comes around and gets it. And so they can be irrevocable, meaning that the bank is saying, you know, at your leisure, come and get it because we've reserved that money. It is, of course, non-revocable. And then, of course, you can have a revocable one that the party can elect to cancel or withdraw the letter of credit. And, of course, that's going to be specified within the letter of credit. Okay, so we've talked about accepting the goods, curing if necessary if they're non-conforming. We talked about paying those goods. We're really not going to talk about this item, which is just furnishing the facilities to accept the goods. We're going to now move on and talk about some special types of sales under Article 2. Again, Article 2 we call actually Chapter 2 in Texas, and this is part of the Uniform Commercial Code. Let's consider a sale on approval. If you're up late at night watching TV, you've probably heard some of these things. When I was young, they had things called Ginsu knives, and they would, in the middle of the night, have these commercials where they would have these various chefs do kind of elaborate knife work. There's kind of a little drama there associated with this. And, you know, what they would do is say, oh, boy, this would be a great price if you were just getting 2 Ginsu knives, but no, if you will buy these Ginsu knives, we'll give you 3 more for free. And no risk to you. We're going to send them to you. If you don't like them, you can send them back, no obligation. But we're sure you're going to love them. And if you you have 10 days to try it, or 30 days, or whatever. Anyway, this is sale on approval. And that's what that type of transaction is. It doesn't have to be from just television alone. It could be really any method. And under these circumstances, the buyer gets to try it out. So that period of time to inspect is elongated. And you know what? Unlike traditional contracts, where the buyer has to point to something about the item that is non-conforming in order to get out of the sale, with a sale on approval, the buyer can just choose on his own. No, I don't like them. I don't. The buyer doesn't need to prove that they're non-conforming. They might be perfectly conforming, but the buyer might say, "Yep, yeah, this is exactly what I ordered, but you know what? I decided I don't really like it that much." So the sale is at the seller's risk until the buyer actually accepts the goods. So an example of the phrasing that we might see on this is a 10-day free trial of the product, which can be returned for a complete refund. Of course, assuming that the product is returned within that free period of time. So that's what a sale on approval is. And I think the name pretty much suggests what we're going for with respect to that. Sale or return, and this is very analogous to the consignment sale. So let's first of all consider the sale or return. You can see here that the buyer really has a choice. He can sell it or he can return it to the seller. And this is usually a situation, I guess always a situation, where the buyer is in fact a retailer or a reseller. You know, Walmart, I'll give the example, doesn't actually manufacture probably anything, or at least not many things. It has some private labels, but it's not in the business of making them. It's hiring a company to make them. So let's say that Walmart wants to sell Toro lawnmowers in its stores. And so it decides, you know what, last year we sold 1,000 lawnmowers. We think we'll probably sell about 1,000 this year. So it might enter into a contract with Toro for 1,000 lawnmowers. But because Walmart has such a large market share, so much power within the industry, it might have a provision in its contract with Toro that says sale or return. And how this would work is that Walmart says, listen, Toro, we'll try to sell your lawnmowers. That's a profit for us. That's good for you, win-win. But maybe the economy will turn south and maybe more people won't be buying lawnmowers. Maybe we'll only sell 900 lawnmowers. If that happens, we want the right to be able to return the 100 lawnmowers we weren't able to sell. So basically, the original seller, Toro, bears the risk of Walmart not being successful at selling it. You can see how that's a really sweet spot for retailers to be in. They want a sale or return situation because they're not bearing the risk of managing that inventory. So here's the definition. The buyer, who is also a reseller, again, think Walmart, can return unsold goods to the original seller, oftentimes the manufacturer. But the reseller assumes the risk of breakage or theft while the goods are in the reseller's possession. So again, there has to be something in good condition that can be returned, because of course Toro, in my example, is going to want to sell those to somebody else. Okay, well, Walmart was only able to sell 900 of the lawnmowers that it contracted to sell 1,000, so they are returning 100 to us. So now we're going to turn around and try to sell them to somebody else. That's its position. So a seller return is very analogous to a consignment situation. A consignment is a transaction in which the buyer, again, who's also the reseller, accepts goods conditioned upon a future sale. We use the term consignment usually when the buyer is, the original seller is more of a consumer. Imagine that my children have outgrown their baby clothes and I don't expect to have any more children. Well, I don't really need a lot of baby clothes now, but I might take them to a consignment store for baby's clothes. And then the store would say, okay, we'll try to sell this stuff for you. and we'll take a portion if we sell it. We'll keep you. We'll give you a portion of the proceeds. If the items never sell, though, you can come back and you can pick those up, and they'll be yours again. And so you won't have sold them, you won't have made any money, but they can return, and you can maybe try to sell them someplace else, or keep them or give them away, or whatever you want to do. So this terminology usually is discussing that scenario, but you can see factually it's the same as the seller return situation. Let's consider a different type of sale that we have under Article 2, and this is the auction sale. And again, an auction sale is exactly what you think it is. We have a guy with a gavel. You don't have to have the gavel, but you can imagine a guy with a gavel who talks really fast, and he says, going, going, gone, and he hits this gavel on the tabletop. Okay, so that's what an auction is what you think it is. Here is the definition that we have. Our textbook hasn't defined this term, so you are responsible for knowing this definition even though it's not provided in the textbook. And here's our definition. An auctioneer, this guy, offers goods for sale to the public, these people, and the public makes bids on the goods. The person with the highest bid buys the good. So there's another way to think about auctions. One is we can think about an auction being with reserve or without reserve. And again, these are two terms we don't have in our textbook, but you are responsible for them. So what is a with reserve? Well, first of all, with reserve is a good thing for the seller. Sellers usually do better with reserve. And this would be the situation where the auctioneer says, this is the lowest price I'm going to take on this particular item. Now, it might be that once he announces that, everybody's like, gosh, I don't want to pay that much. And so if the reserve price is set too high, then nobody's going to make an offer, and so there won't be a sale. Of course, if people say, oh, wow, I think it's worth more than that reserve price, then there starts to be the bidding above that reserve price. But the auctioneer isn't going to accept any prices below the reserve price. Typically, people who sell with a reserve price try to set the reserve price about as low as they're willing to sell the item for. If you set it too high, then you aren't going to be able to participate in the psychological things that happen in auction. One of the things that happens in an auction, or at least you're hoping for the seller it's going to happen, is that people kind of get swept away and they almost see it as a competition. Oh, he's going to top my bid. Well, I'll top his bid. Well, I'll top his bid. Well, I'll top her bids. And so you kind of want that psychology, that competitiveness to kick in. If you set your reserve price too high, you may not ever see that dynamic play out. And so a relatively low reserve price helps you get to that situation, potentially at least. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes sellers present items without reserve. And then, let's just do the definition for reserve before we go on to this one. The auctioneer can withdraw an item for sale if the minimum price, the reserve price, which is set by the seller, is not met. Without reserve, obviously it's just the reverse. Once the bidding begins, the auctioneer cannot withdraw the item no matter how low the final bid. So here, the reserve price is essentially zero. Any price above zero is going to potentially result in a sale. If it happens that for whatever reason the high rollers are miss their plane, or they're snowed in or whatever, and so there really aren't the big people with the big bucks, you might end up getting a real deal, getting something of significant value at a bargain basement price, because it's possible that it will close at a low price because it was without a reserve. Both types are perfectly lawful contracts. There's also lots of other auction styles, but these are just two examples to kind of show you how you might set up an auction as the seller. In your textbook, you'll find a variety of clauses that can cover various aspects of what we've talked about in this chapter for your UCC contract. I have one example here, but there's lots in the textbook. It's good as you progress in your career to have a collection of these kind of boilerplate clauses so that you can slide them into contracts as you have the need going forward. Many times legal professionals will kind of collect these items so they have them for point of reference. You can also use form books for these types of things, and also obviously Westlaw or Lexis will have form books online that you can use for this purpose. I hope that this information has been helpful for you. As always, if you have questions about the material, please don't hesitate to send me an email to ask those questions, or to stop by my office hours and we can talk about these in more detail. Thanks for your attention, and I hope you have a wonderful day.